Chapter 8. The step was warm, but very steep. If I got down onto the path, Arrietty thought, I might not get up again. So for some moments she sat quietly. After a while she noticed the shoe scraper. Arrietty, called Pod softly, where have you got to? I just climbed down the shoe scraper, she called back. He came along and looked down at her from the top of the step. That's all right, he said after a moment's stare, but never climb down anything that isn't fixed like. Supposing one of them came along and moved the shoe scraper, where would you be then? How would you get up? It's heavy to move, said Arrietty. Maybe, but it's movable. See what I mean? There's rules, my lass, and you got to learn. This path, Arrietty said, goes round the house, and the bank does too. Well, said Pod, what of it? Arrietty rubbed one kid shoe on a rounded stone. It's my grating, she explained. I was thinking that my grating must be just around the corner. My grating looks out to this bank. Your grating, exclaimed Pod. Since when has it been your grating? I was thinking, Arrietty went on, suppose I just went round the corner and called through the grating to Mother. No, said Pod. We're not going to have none of that. None going round quarters. Then went on Arrietty, she'd see I was all right, like. Well, said Pod, and then half smiled. Go quickly then and call. I'll watch for you here. Not loud, mind. Arrietty ran. The stones in the path were firmly bedded in her, and her light, soft shoes hardly seemed to touch them. How glorious it was to run. You could never run under the floor. You walked, you stooped, you crawled, but you never ran. Arrietty nearly ran past the grating. She saw it just in time after she turned the corner. Yes, there it was, quite close to the ground, embedded deeply in the old wall of the house. There was moss below it in a spreading greenish stain. Arrietty ran up to it. Mother, she called, her nose against the iron grill. Mother! She waited quietly, and after a moment she called again. At the third call, Homily came. Her hair was coming down, and she carried, though it were heavy, the screw lid of a pickle jar filled with soapy water. Oh, she said in an annoyed voice, you didn't give me half a turn. What do you think you're up to? Where's your father? Arrietty jerked her head sideways. Just there, by the front door. She was so full of happiness that, out of Homily's sight, her toes danced on the green moss. Here she was on the other side of the grating. Here she was at last, on the outside, looking in. Yes, said Homily, they opened that door like that, the first day of spring. Well, she went on briskly, you run back to your father and tell him, if the morning room does happen to be open, I wouldn't say no to a bit of red blotting paper. Mind, out of my way now, while I throw the water. That's what grows the moss, thought Arrietty as she sped back to her father. All the water we empty through the grating. Pod looked relieved when he saw her, but frowned at the message. How'd she expect me to climb that desk without me pin? Blotting paper is a curtain and chair job, and she should know it. Come on now, up with you. Let me stay down, pleaded Arrietty, just a bit longer, just till you finish. They're all out, except her. Mother said so. She'd say anything, grumbled Pod, when she wants something quick. How does she know she won't take it into her head to get out of bed, that bed of hers, and come down with a stick? How does she know Mrs. Driver ain't stayed at home today with a headache? How does she know that boy ain't still here? What boy? Asked Arrietty. Pod looked embarrassed. What boy? He repeated vaguely and went on. Or maybe Crampfurl. Crampfurl isn't a boy, said Arrietty. No, he isn't, said Pod. Not in a manner of speaking, no. He went on as though thinking this out. No, you wouldn't call Crampfurl a boy. Not as you might say a boy exactly. Well, he said, beginning to move away, stay down a bit if you like, but stay close. Arrietty watched him move away from the step, and then she looked about her. Oh, glory, oh, joy, oh, freedom. The sunlight, the grasses, the soft moving air, and halfway up the bank, where it curved round the corner, a flowering cherry tree. Below it on the path lay a stain of pinkish petals, and at the tree's foot, pale as butter, a nest of primroses. Arrietty threw a cautious glance toward the front door, and then, light and dancing in her soft red shoes, she ran toward the petals. They were curved like shells and rocked as she touched them. She gathered several up and laid them one inside the other, up, 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 like a card castle. Then she spilled them. Pod came again to the top of the step and looked along the path. Don't you go far, he said after a moment. Seeing his lips move, she smiled back at him. She was too far already to hear the words. A greenish beetle, shining in the sunlight, came toward her across the stones. She laid her fingers lightly on its shell, and it stood still, waiting and watchful. And when she moved her hand, the beetle went swiftly on. An ant came hurrying by in a busy zigzag. She danced in front of it to tease it and put out her foot. It stared at her, nonplussed, waving its antennae. Then, pettishly, as though put out, it swerved away. 2 birds came down, quarreling shrilly in the grass below the trees. One flew away, but Arrietty could see the other among the moving grass stems above her on the slope. Cautiously, she moved toward the bank and climbed a little nervously in amongst the green blades. As she parted them gently with her bare hands, drops of water plopped on her skirt, and she felt the red shoes become damp. But on she went, pulling herself up now and again by rooty stems into this jungle of moss and wood violet and creeping leaves of clover. The sharp-seeming grade blades, waist high, were tender to the touch and sprang back lightly behind her as she passed. When at last she reached the foot of the tree, the bird took fright and flew away, and she sat down suddenly on a gnarled leaf of primrose. The air was filled with its scent, but nothing will play with you, she thought, and saw the cracks and furrows of the primrose leaves held crystal beads of dew. If she pressed the leaf, they rolled like marbles. The bank was warm, almost too warm here within the shelter of the tall grass, and the sandy earth smelled dry. Standing up, she picked a primrose. The pink stalk felt tender and living in her hand and was covered in silvery hairs. When she held the flower like a parasol between her eyes and the sky, she saw the sun's pale light through the veined petals. On a piece of bark, she found a woodlouse, and she struck it lightly with her swaying flower. It curled immediately and became a ball, bumping softly away downhill in amongst the grass roots. But she knew about woodlice. There were plenty of them at home under the floor. Homily always scolded her if she played with them because she said they smelled of old knives. She lay back among the stalks of the primroses, and they made a coolness between her and the sun. And then, sighing, she turned her head, looked sideways up the bank among the grass stems. Startled, she caught her breath. Something had moved above her on the bank. Something had glittered. Arrietty stared.